Students, no. Just bring you to order. Attention. Okay, thanks for coming. I'm Stuart Hale Shakman. This is Brian Hutchins, and you are?
Kaylee. I'm Kaylee. I'm Tyler.
Nice to meet you, and thank you for coming. This is Autohemotherapy. We're calling it the magic shot. It may be. It certainly is not harmful. Go right ahead. Questions at any time. We're open for questions.
I just wanted to make sure you didn't mind giving this whole presentation just for us.
I'm sorry. This is fine. Actually, this is a maiden voyage for this presentation. So I needed guinea pigs to practice on. Okay.
At least 3 people in the room besides you.
Okay. Now, this is what I was telling you about where this project came from. I'm going to get a pointer. We have the spiffy pointer here. Can this focus? Can these things focus?
Oh, the little knob there, I think, where your hand is. Yeah.
This one focuses
that's
it? Oh, she does, doesn't it? Okay, that's better, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Genesis, Stranded in the Jungle. I was working, trying to help set up a music program at a little bar in San Francisco, and Bert Kuyigan, the proprietor, asked me on a couple occasions if I could work the day, and I said, no, Bert, I'm working on my science project, which Brian's familiar with. It's at hydration.com, and it's mathematics and science and how they interrelate, and an algebraic foundation that does exist and people are ignoring. But we won't go into that too much today, but except as it may relate to some of the things that we're going to come across here. So I said, Bert, I can't work days. I'm doing this project. And Bert says, well, let me tell you about this thing. When I was a kid, I was 14 years old. My father was 65. He was a doctor. And we were chased out. It was 1942. They were chased out of their home and went to the mountains of Pampanga province, where they ran out of quinine after a couple of months, and the malaria season hit. So he said, well, my dad told me to start drawing blood, and we take 10 cc's of blood out of the arm and inject it into the buttocks muscle, and he claims to have cured 40 cases of malaria. And I said, Bert, I'm not really into voodoo, but I didn't know if voodoo came from the Philippines or not. But he was pretty persistent on it, so I looked into it, and Bert had hopes that this might help people with different diseases, including AIDS, because it's supposedly spread by the blood. So I started looking. He was a very sincere guy, and I started looking into it and asked some people who were more knowledgeable about these things, and they said theoretically it might work, but nobody's ever. It felt like an earthquake, doesn't it? No one's ever tried it. So as far as he knew. So anyway, I went into the library, and I found. I didn't find anything on the use of blood, but I did find autogenous vaccines here. I can just point right over here. I did find autogenous vaccines of surround with Wright. So I thought, okay, it's a vaccine, and all the principles were laid out by Wright. So I started to write this up, and then I found that there actually was something called autohemotherapy. It was buried under the serum therapy literature, and I found about 1,000 articles that were written about autohemotherapy. So this took on another, and then all around the same time, I came across a guy named Edward Rosenau here. Now, Rosenau used autogenous vaccines. I came across him in the vaccine literature. And back in 1915, people were praising Rosenau for having perfected vaccine therapy. But he never used autohemotherapy, but he did refer to a bunch of different diseases that he showed how there was an organism in the blood. So I said, oh, okay, here's the guy who was in the Mayo Clinic 30 years. He shows there's an organism in the blood, so I can use him as evidence that this is probably a vaccine. I'll wrap it up in tie it up in a little knot. But then here's a guy that was with the Mayo Clinic for 30 years. Where did he say the organism came from? He said it came from the teeth and tonsils. So this tied up another 8 or 9 years looking into Rosenau and trying to find something that was wrong with his work. And I'll get more into that in the second part of the lecture. in the process of that, I found this guy, came across a guy named Holman, who had really clearly defrauded Rosenau. He played with his numbers. But the significance of Holman was that he was a well-respected and well-known bacteriologist. And in the 30s, this was 1928, when he did this very elaborate 70-page article talking about this concept of teeth and disease and saying that it's a good concept, but Rosenau didn't prove anything. And the data that he used to show that Rosenau didn't prove anything was manufactured data. It's totally bogus. The problem is that this guy Holman was well respected enough that all the dentists in the 30s and 40s that were organizing to do root canal therapy, they all referred to his work or they referred to each other. And if you go into that literature, underneath it, there's nothing there except Holman, and he's totally bogus. So then I'm calling this super synthesis that perhaps this whole conglomeration gives us a real step on a medical synthesis and on uniting medicine, and so we'll get more into that. Here's a little bit on some of the early research. I saw that Dr. Kuyigan was using 10 cc's. Oh, okay, thank you, Brian. He was using 10 cc's of blood. He'd swirl it around in a culture dish. And just before it coagulated, he put it into the buttocks muscle, and he said, but for a child, he was using 5 cc's for a child, and I was trying to figure out where that came from. Then when I was looking into malaria treatment, I saw that for adults they were using 10 grains of quinine and about half of that for children. So maybe that's how they calculated the dosage. As of this time, I didn't know about autohemotherapy. I just knew that they were re-injecting blood. So by this time now, I had come across auto vaccine therapy, and there were about 300 articles written about this between 1900 and 1950, at least in the index called auto vaccine therapy. And autohemotherapy, I found about 1,000 articles written, and Rosenau, who lived in the same period, he wrote about over 300 articles and published. And although he was really highly touted as having perfected vaccine therapy, none of those 300 vaccine therapy articles had Rosenau as an author. So it was separate, even though he used vaccine therapy. He's more thought of in terms of the tooth disease connection, although his vaccines were said to be miraculous. And I do have those, the best description of his vaccines, I do have posted on the internet at the Institute of Science website. So all of these three things sort of coexisted, and they kind of, in modern literature, of course, Rosenau passed on, and his last article was published in 1957, but they all kind of coexisted, and I think they all sort of tie together. So we'll go more into a little bit more here. Here's a listing of some of the diseases that show up both in the autohemotherapy literature and in Rosenau's literature, and this is what really got me sort of curious here. Even such things as alcoholism, which we now see in the modern literature, they're saying how it is a disease and there's something. Well, the best that I could, within this context, it seems like it may be a sort of a nervous system intoxication that is fed by the alcohol. That there may be an intoxication, that there may be a bacteria involved as well. All of these other ones, appendicitis, arthritis, anemia, long before Rosenau wrote about this, this was being discussed in connection with the teeth. Eye diseases, glaucoma. There were a bunch of articles written in the 1800s about the connection between teeth and eye disease. So, fairly broad range of diseases, and we see we're talking here not about, gum disease or whatever. We're talking about systemic diseases in general. And we can start to understand, if you look at the body's pretty sealed. Even, we eat things, but doesn't get into the body, and it goes, through. So when we have an opening to the outside, it's generally thought of as an ulcer. And the only place where the body tolerates those is in the oral area. Any place else, you just don't have them. So there's a little logic there that helps us to maybe start to understand it. Now, here's what made autohemotherapy possible. Technology, the syringe, the hypodermic needle. And this didn't exist a couple hundred years ago, so they couldn't have had autohemotherapy. So now, there are different techniques, and you'll find autohemotherapy actually even in the modern literature. Right in this building next door, there is a doctor, and there's these guys a PhD, Jeff something, PhD, and a doctor's office, and they have a big machine that does what's called major autohemotherapy. Through the literature, the historical literature, there are some references to that where the blood is taken out, it's defibrinated, or it is treated with an anticoagulant and then goes back intravenously. Whether that is any better than just taking out some blood and re-injecting it intramuscularly is there's a good question about that. I don't think it is. I think you're getting the same direct effect by just taking out some blood, injecting it into the muscle. Anything in the blood is going to die. It loses, you win. Your body identifies that as an invader, and manufactures antibodies. Sir Almouth Wright, we'll touch on him a little bit as we go on. He felt like all serum therapy, where you were taking things and putting it into the serum, that was actually vaccine therapy. It was only after it passed through the body accidentally it would go into some tissues, then form antibodies, so it was indirect. So that if that's the case, then this form of major autohemotherapy is basically the same thing. It acts because eventually it will get into some tissues and form antibodies, but it's a lot more dangerous and perhaps less efficient. I suggested to one of these docs that we do some type of comparison between the intramuscular or the intravenous, and see if some patients, somewhere they're doing these patients one way and do it with the other and see what happens. But we get into this thing of these are very well-meaning people, but if it's proved that intramuscular autohemotherapy is just as efficient, just as beneficial as the other, they've got a machine that costs several $1,000s or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars that's unneeded, and I think it's unneeded anyway. But anyway, there are different types of autohemotherapy all the way through history, but predominantly it has been involved the immediate re-injection of autologous whole blood. Brian?
When you inject into the muscle, does that mean you're just putting into the capillary network and it's reabsorbed that way, as opposed to into a vein?
It's absorbed into the tissues. It's the same principle Sir Almouth Wright said, always inject into the tissues. And because that's where the antibodies are formed. And Florence Sabin did some breakthrough work in 1935 that demonstrated that this is where the antibodies are formed. And this is on Sabin's work. This is what Linus Pauling built his work, and some of the modern work on the manufacture of autobodies was based on that. So it's that principle that you go into the tissues. That's where your antibodies are formed. Did I answer it?
But you're not actually trying to go through some vein or something. You're just...
No, you're trying to just go into tissues. Just the same principle when you get a vaccine against something, it's a therapeutic vaccine, and it's the same principle. Now, autohemotherapy, though, has different origins, and it did originate in the serum therapy of Kitasato and Behring. Then the first form they were just using, this is the serum therapy concept, which was really attacked by Sir Almouth Wright. He did not agree with what was thought to be the principle.
Blood serum?
Blood serum. Well, serum, you had a disease, you got over it, I've got the disease, take your serum, because presumably that has antibodies, and infuse that into me and see if that'll... Actually, now they were doing it with giving doses to horses and giving those horses a disease and injecting something from the horse into people. And it is dangerous. There were several deaths from the serum therapy thing.
It was the same as evolution as with cowpox, right? Taking the pox.
The cowpox was Jenner, and that was vaccine, the origin of vaccine therapy.
It sounds very similar.
It is similar, but this was called, we have two schools of thought here. Serum therapy, where it's called it's supposedly passive immunization. You got the immunization, you give it to me, or the horse gives it to me, so I'm taking it from you. The other vaccine therapy is the concept of active immunization. You give me the bad guy and I develop the antibodies myself, okay? So this is the passive side, but they do interrelate once we get more and more into autohemotherapy. The first guy that was known for was called autoserotherapy, was this Gilbert of Geneva. I never found his last name in any of the literature, but he took autologous serum and injected it. He was using it for inflammation of the lung, for lung inflammations, and he was successful. Oh, they call it pleuritis. Thank you. I'm blanking on it. Then Elfstrom came along and tried to do with blood. He used blood from leeches and Kupus pneumonia, and was successful with that. But then he tried to take the blood out of a vein, and he injected it, and the one patient that he tried that with died, so he stayed with the leeches. So then we don't find the use of blood, re-injected directly, the blood, until this guy Vez with, Gilbert of Geneva, what he was doing, it was pleuritis, and he was taking the pleural fluid out. And as he would draw, in pleuritis apparently it's beneficial if you take out if the fluid builds up, you release the fluid. What he would do is before he took the needle out, he would put a slight amount in under the skin, subcutaneously, and that was curing all these cases of pleuritis. Then Elfstrom actually used blood from leeches, and Vez used autoserum, the actual your own serum, defibrinated it and injected it intramuscularly. Then the real movement toward autohemotherapy as a field came with 1913, where this Frenchman Revault took whole blood and re-injected it intramuscularly immediately. There was a guy named Speedoff who was much more better known, a German, who was much better known, and he was using autoserum by that time. And then Revault, who was obviously his competitor, went and just used the whole blood. Speedoff didn't even want to recognize Revault. He said, well, there were other people that did that, and I can see, but anyway, historically, the field does now recognize that Revault was the guy that really did it. So we just have, of course, leeches historically were used not just to draw blood and re-inject it, but just in and of themselves as a means of bloodletting, and even in modern times now, leeches are being used for, they have the anticoagulant Hirudin that they manufacture, and so they're being used as far as putting on, like if somebody cuts their ear off, they're using leeches to help to draw the blood, and there are other uses as well. Just a little diagram on bloodletting. These didn't come out too well, but some of the tools. Bloodletting was we kind of look down on it now, but it was very sophisticated science for many years, and we bloodletting was known even from the time of Hippocrates, of course, and he used bloodletting in certain instances. It's interesting that the Hippocratic Oath, we hear a lot about it, but no one ever mentions that it is against abortion. He comes right out and says you're not, The other thing that some of the practitioners don't normally mention was that Hippocrates said the doctor should never ask for money first. You take care of your patient first, and then you deal with the money. And he was very adamant about that. Of course, we've gone in some other directions now. Galen, who is probably the most influential person in the history of medicine. It was like from, what do we have here, 130 AD. He lived from 130 to 200 AD. And his medical work really held up all the way through until, really very recent modern times. And he was an aggressive bleeder, and especially in some of his young soldiers. He catered to the soldiers in some of the wars, and they were prime subjects for bleeding. But we find that bloodletting hasn't disappeared. It's still, if you look in the Medline, I'm a few years behind here, but there are several references to bloodletting and phlebotomy and venesection in the modern literature, so it hasn't totally disappeared. And some of the early literature on autohemotherapy even suggests that perhaps the reason that bloodletting worked was because it was actually autohemotherapy. And we have to really start to think about how bloodletting began. And it began in the best way, I mean, it predates written records, but there are instances in the written record where people would injure them, someone with epilepsy injured themselves, and they were healed. And no explanation for that. Well, in the autohemotherapy literature, some people have suggested that this is because of the autohemotherapeutic action. Same thing with an exploratory operation. You go and explore to see if you're going to do something, they sew him up, and he was better, or she was better. And again, that is possibly accidental autohemotherapy. And some people have suggested even the bloodletting, that what happened is somebody had like epilepsy or so on, they cut themselves, they started to bleed, it solved the problem, and so at some point the medical practitioners started doing bloodletting. So, but what's interesting is even the most modern now of treatments, the state-of-the-art, bone marrow transplantation, is moving more and more into autologous. And this was just some of the trends. The trends as of, I went up to 1985, and I really have to update this, but as of then, and projecting those trends, we would find that the increase in autologous, using your own bone marrow as opposed to somebody else's, was progressing to where it would, by the year 2004, that bone marrow transplantation will be mostly autologous. The other trend that's happening is that instead of bone marrow, more and more there is the use of blood instead of bone marrow. And first it was stem cells from the blood. But some of the literature has started to talk about, well, just use the whole blood. Okay, so what we have is, and even it was suggested that the editor of Bone Marrow Transplantation was suggesting that they rename their magazine to be called Blood and Bone Marrow Transplantation. So what we have are, when we're using our own and it's blood, it's autohemotherapy. So the future of bone marrow transplantation is autohemotherapy. So we have this type of activity may underlie both bloodletting, bone marrow transplantation as well. So we might have a common mechanism here.
Can I ask them?
You sure may, at any time, please. Any questions are
So
fine.
they're suggesting that you can use blood in a bone marrow transplant, blood not containing stem cells?
No, blood does contain stem cells, of course. But there have been a couple articles, and I haven't looked at the literature for a couple, 3 years, but where instead of separating out the stem cells, they just took the whole blood. Yeah, Oglethorpe, I think, was the name of one of the writers on it, and he just said it's just as good, and it's of course much more efficient. You just take it and just do it. So once you're there, you're talking about autohemotherapy. Okay.
Although most blood contains stem cells, it's not very viable stem cells unless it's fetal cord blood or my.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know, but the stem cells that are being used in bone marrow transplantation are not being taken from fetuses, are they?
Most of them are.
Most are?
Fetal cord blood. A lot of that's why
Okay.
now during births they're asking people to donate their fetal cord blood.
Okay. Okay, but I think it does exist in other blood as well, I believe.
Okay.
Anyway, this one guy recommended just using whole blood, and I think there was a couple articles on it. So if you're doing autologous, then it's autohemotherapy. Now this is a little bit on vaccine therapy, because while I was trying to figure it out, I spent some time with Sir Almouth Wright, and he talked about all of the theory is all right there of talked about spontaneous auto-inoculation, so that according to Wright, the reason exercise is good for you is it sends the blood around, and anything that's doing you harm, it's a form of autologous auto-inoculation. And then he was artificial auto-inoculation, autogenous vaccines. Wright advocated small doses, widely spaced. And he was critical of serum therapy because it just went in an opposite direction. He emphasized that it should be into the tissues. And Suramat Wright, he's not all that well known today, but if you ever read Bernard Shaw, Dr. Dilemma, he was the inspiration for that. And it's acknowledged right in the beginning of the book. They were friends. And it's talking about opsonins, or the antibodies, his word for antibodies. The origin of vaccines, of course, is Jenner, that's the cowpox, where he performed his experiments on an animal called an 8-year-old boy, and it worked. Not all of, we read about the ones that work, we don't see too much about the ones that didn't work. And then following that, Pasteur, Pasteur came up with the attenuated microbes to as a prophylactic vaccine. And then Sir Almroth Wright perfected or was well known for developing autogenous vaccines. You've got a disease, get the organism from you, make a vaccine, and give it to you. And that way you're getting the right organism. Again, Sir Almroth Wright, he is not nearly as famous as some of his people that worked for him. John Freeman was his son in science, and he did some very important work on allergies. Leishman, we hear of Leishman stain, Leishman eyes. These were guys that worked for Sir Almroth Wright. They were all his proteges. Leonard Colebrook was very, very important in the development of sulfonamides. And, of course, Alexander Fleming, who is known for the discovery of penicillin. Alexander Fleming, if it weren't for Sir Almroth Wright, he would have been a footnote, because Wright, the other people that were involved with the development of penicillin were getting the credit in a London Times article, and Sir Almroth Wright said, hey, don't forget about Fleming. He's the guy in whose culture dish it was found. And if it wasn't, like I say, if it wasn't for Sir Almroth Wright, he probably would not. Now Fleming, everybody thinks it's just Fleming. And of course it wasn't. Fleming gave up on it. Fleming couldn't do anything with it. It was up to some other people picked up on it and made it work.